Cool. Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. Today we're doing a Thai noodle stir fry. That's pretty commonly found here in the States. I would say maybe the most popular one that you'll generally find in most Thai restaurants, at least here in California, called Pad Thai. Pad Thai is a pretty commonly found takeout dish here in Thai restaurants around California. That relies very, very heavily on the use of a couple of things, actually, but the main thing that stands out to me, at least, that it leans on very heavily is the use of tamarind paste. So we're going to take a look at that and exactly what tamarind paste is and how to work around it if you can't find tamarind paste, because tamarind paste is a little bit tricky to find. Today I'm actually going to be not going to be using tamarind paste, but actually we'll be using some Pad Thai sauce, which is like a mix that you generally will find made by brands like Lee Kum Kee and stuff like that. So we're going to take a look at that and take a look at what exactly is in a Pad Thai mix and how is it different from tamarind paste, because if you know why it's different, then you can kind of adjust accordingly. So if you have any questions for me, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I don't know everything about Pad Thai, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully we can be helpful or informative or at the very least entertaining to watch. As with everything that we cook on stream, there's a recipe video that goes along with this one. It always lives over on my YouTube channel, so if you haven't made your way over to the YouTube yet, definitely head over there next. Lots of fun stuff coming up over there. We have new recipes. Those are popping up every Friday. We're also live streaming every Tuesday and Thursday. So if you're looking for fun new things to make for dinner, that's a cool place to check out. We're also working our way up to 5,500 subscribers by the end of the month, so if you want to help us hit our subscriber goal, please hop over and subscribe. Lots of fun stuff going on. Cool. So, diving in first, we're starting off with our aromatics here. So this is my garlic, which we just crushed and minced. Not really minced, more like crushed and then like rough chopped. Garlic, because it is so fragile, it comes apart really, really quickly. You don't actually have to do very much to it in order for it to just start falling apart. If you give it a good whack with your knife, it really just starts coming apart from there. Once you crush it, it starts releasing that allicin, which is where all of the flavor of your garlic lives. Which is why I always say I actually just did a recipe for garlic noodles where I sliced the garlic very thinly instead of crushed it. And in those scenarios when you're not crushing that garlic, you will find that you have to use a lot more garlic, so I had to triple the quantity of garlic that I was using for that recipe, which worked out because I was making garlic noodles, so you actually need quite a bit of garlic. But if you want to derive more flavor from your garlic, what I always say is crush it, because it's going to release that allicin. You're going to get a lot more flavor out of it. Alright, so next up, moving on with our aromatics, this is about 1 tablespoon or roughly about an inch's worth of ginger, which we're going to fine mince, just like our garlic. Unlike the garlic though, because while garlic is very, very fragile and a very delicate veggie, ginger on the other hand is a root veggie, which means that it is not as delicate. So super often, if you don't like doing your chopping like this, you can also pass it through a microplane because it is that sturdy of a veggie. If you don't like using microplanes, if you're like me and you don't like using microplanes, then I generally avoid my microplane anytime that I can possibly do that because I don't like cleaning it. You can also just do a fine mince, which really is just about persistence and having a very, very sharp knife, I think, which you should have anyway. But also, if you don't have a sharp knife, this would be a good thing to use a microplane for. But also get your knife sharpened. What are you doing? Alright. We do a little bit better than that. Like I said, ginger, it's really just about persistence, so you can stop early if you want. I have often stopped early on the ginger if you're feeling lazy. Not the end of the world, but what it means is there's going to be a few errant pieces of ginger floating around in your stir fry. Right, so that's our ginger. Next up, these are going to be a couple of green onions, which are a little bit old. These are only a day old, actually. I'm kind of disappointed that they're starting to go. If they do start to go, so basically you'll know pretty quickly if it's starting to go, because it basically starts looking like a wilting flower, which looks a little bit like this. These should be rigid, more like that. When they start going limp like this, that's generally a sign that your green onions are starting to spoil, which is not good. So generally what I look for, a couple of things, is when it goes really, really limp like this is not a good sign. So we want to pull that stuff off. The other thing that I also like to look for, though, especially if you store those green onions in water like this, is when they start getting really, really thin on the ends like that. What that's a sign of, here's another one like this, is that the green onion, it's continuing to grow, which will happen especially if you store it in water, because they're a living, breathing vegetable, just like anything else, because it still has its root end attached. So what I like to do when that starts happening is we want to generally just pick that little tapered end off, because the tapered end, it tends to be a little bit more bitter, and maybe not the most, maybe not the thing that you want to include in your stir fry, especially for, in this case, if you're going to be using those greens as a garnish, which is what we're going to be doing today. The reason being because when it's a garnish, it's still raw. When it's still raw, that bitterness that comes out of that really, really small tapered end really, really pops out. We want to try and avoid that. So right here, this is generally what you'll see me refer to in a lot of recipes as our aromatics. So that's my garlic, ginger, and the whites of my green onions. In a lot of stir fries, you'll see me starting off with these three things that then definitely tends to be more of like the Chinese approach to stir frying, but and even some of the top ones end up doing it anyway. So next up, for the greens of our green onions, just another one. What I'm doing, another one, is I'm going to slice these up really, really thinly on a bias here, so like so. So we're going to do this diagonally, essentially. Bias, fancy word for diagonal, but we're going to do it super thinly so that they pop out really nicely in our wok fry. I always like to, anytime that I'm using those greens as a garnish, I like to keep them really, really thin, because I find that it kind of blends with the final dish a little bit better. So especially in today's use, because what we want to be using actually is some cilantro, but since we don't have any cilantro, these green onions, they're going to work just fine. But also because we don't have that cilantro, what we're trying to do is replicate that general shape of that cilantro. So there's our greens of our green onions. I wish I had a little bit more greens here, but here we are. We actually threw most of it out just now. So. All right. Next up is maybe a pretty optional one. I actually don't think that you'll see this come up in a lot of pad thai recipes. But I like to add it, and I also think that maybe it doesn't come up so often because pad thai doesn't really lean as heavily into spiciness as some of the other Thai dishes that we often do. But I like it, so I'm going to use it. This is how many we're using? 6. Let's do 5. That's 5 Thai chilies. What I always say anytime that we work with Thai chilies, I always tell folks is that you want to dial this up or down depending on how spicy you like your dishes. Generally, if you're in a restaurant and you ask the restaurant, can you make it like a little bit less spicy or medium spicy or very, very spicy, this is probably the thing that they're adjusting, is how many Thai chilies and how much of the seed ends up in your stir fry. So today I'm using, this is going to be 5 Thai chilies, which is going to be like not super spicy, but it's definitely going to be there. If you don't like spice, you could hold it back. You could do 2 or 3 or even just 1. If you really don't like spices, you could leave it out entirely. You could de-seed it, but I personally find that those seeds, that's where all of the flavor in our Thai chili comes from. If you or if you really hate it, you could also sub it out. You could use something a little bit more mild, like a Serrano or a Fresno. All of those things, any of those things will work just fine too. I think in the original recipe, I may have used a jalapeno because it was just happened to be what I had that day. But if you can get your hands on Thai chilies, I actually find that it's one of the more iconic flavors to a lot of Thai cuisine. So what I always recommend is find it and use it if you can get your hands on it. These Thai chilies, though, because we are leaving those seeds in, they're going to include quite a bit of capsaicin, which is where all of the heat comes from. Capsaicin, it has a quality about it. It doesn't wash off your hands with antibiotic soap. It doesn't come off with dish soap. All of those things, it kind of just sticks around. So generally, what you really should be doing is probably wearing gloves, is what I should be doing. If you don't wear gloves, though, just make sure that you don't touch your eyes for a while, because that capsaicin, it's going to stay on your hands for a while. Do I slice on a bias for a garnish? Yeah. If I was using it for a garnish, yeah, so I am actually using it for a garnish, which is why I like slicing it on a bias. But basically what happens when you slice green onions on a bias is that they hold a little bit more shape, so we can compare. So here it is when it's sliced on a bias. It's a little bit larger, kind of has, it's also really pretty too, which is nice. So it's a little bit larger, holds just a little bit more physical space, which I find is really appealing. Whereas like these straight cuts, they're a little bit more circular and they're just generally not holding as much physical space. That tends to be a little bit better for the whites because we're going to be stir frying it. So it kind of just works a little bit better in like holding together the vegetable as it stir fries. But for a garnish like that, I like to use it on a bias because it will hold a little bit more physical space, especially if, like today, we're running a little bit low on green onions because we just picked off a bunch of the dead leaves, which means that there's probably not going to be enough to go around. So here we are. But because when they're cut on a bias like that, they hold a little bit more physical space in the stir fry, which makes it a little bit just more present. Cool. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's your dream to learn to cook more about cooking Thai food. Yeah, that's great. Definitely cook more Thai food. We actually have a lot of Thai noodles. I've been cooking a lot of Thai food lately. I find, especially like Thai street cuisine, it runs through a lot of like the quintessential techniques of wok stir frying and just generally a lot of good lessons to learn about like how to approach like wok cooking on a home range because Thai food, especially like Thai street food, it can include so many different vegetables, which makes it a little bit tricky for cooking on a home range. So when I'm trying to like talk to folks or like kind of walk folks through like the techniques of batch cooking, I find that Thai cooking just generally holds a lot of lesson. Yeah. Yeah, comida, yes. My Spanish very bad. Cool. All right, so next up, what I'm doing is I'm slicing up, these are some carrots. I think in a super traditional pad thai, you probably wouldn't see a carrot. What I actually wanted to do before I got this carrot out was use some bean sprouts, which would be probably the more traditional thing to use in a pad thai. Those bean sprouts, they turned out they were bad. They were very bad. They spoiled probably a week ago or more, which really sucks because I was really looking forward to eating some bean sprouts today. But since we don't have any bean sprouts, I'm subbing that out for some carrot, which actually is pretty commonly found in a lot of pad thai here in the States. But what I would say is if you can find those bean sprouts, I think they're going to taste a lot better. But here we are. It won't be the end of the world. For our carrots, though, what I'm doing is I'm slicing this very, very thinly on a julienne cut. So what I'm doing is I'm cooking it slices down the center, and then we're pushing it over and essentially folding it on top of itself, like so. So it's basically just like stacked on top of itself, and then we're basically just chopping down from there. Like so. Julienne cut, also a really great opportunity to practice your claw technique because it is very, very difficult. It's maybe the most difficult chop that I know how to do. It's also the same reason why I hate doing the julienne cut. So here it is one more time. We're giving it slices down the center like so. And then we're stacking everything on top of itself and then flipping it on its side. And then just chopping downward from there. And then what's going to happen is because those carrots are stacked on top of itself, we're going to hopefully, it's kind of a bad job just now, but hopefully if you do it correctly, I should end up with lots of even pieces of julienne chopped carrots, unlike what I just did. It was a really bad julienne chop just now. Don't do that. Yeah, fine. Yeah, very thin, yeah. Yeah, let's try that again. That was a bad julienne chop. So we're going with thin slices. At this point, if you stopped here, you could probably call this a plank. And then I'm flipping it on its side, and then we're chopping down. So, that's a little bit better. Yeah. Alright, one more. This, by the way, probably the most time-consuming part of this dish. If you really want to, if you really don't like doing julienne cuts, you could probably get away with doing a plank chop and just stopping at the plank. But the julienne cut, it's probably going to plate a little bit better. Alright, there's our carrots. So those carrots, just like any other time that we use carrots in a stir fry, these are going to be probably the most durable thing in our whole stir fry. So we're going to throw these in pretty early, and we want to give it a little bit of a head start because they're going to take a little bit more time to cook. Yeah. Next up, I actually remembered to buy shallots today, but I bought them in Chinatown, which means that every time that I buy shallots in Chinatown, they're going to be a little bit moldy, like this one, which is very annoying. I'm probably just going to throw this whole one out. Chinatown shallots, they're always a little bit like older, don't look so great. And generally, when you find Chinese shallots, they're a little bit smaller, like this. Which gives it a little bit more of an interesting flavor, which is nice, but my actual preference is to go for those bigger American shallots, mainly because they taste similar enough, but Chinese shallots, they're super annoying to chop because you got to peel a lot more of them now, like we're about to do. Do I know what type of wood is this cutting board? I believe it is mahogany, I think. Don't quote me on that. Maintenance for it, yeah, lots of people ask me about maintenance. RKK6, how's it going? Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, lots of people ask me about this cutting board. It's not a fancy cutting board, it's not a Bose. I would like a Bose cutting board. But no, it's a Good Grips cutting board that I think I got it from like Bed Bath & Beyond for like 20 bucks or something. My favorite part about it, actually, we could show it. I just get it. Pull out. My favorite part about this cutting board actually is the fact, it's not actually the wood, but the fact that it has these grips on the bottom, which is very, very useful because it keeps the cutting board from slipping around. So if you've ever used a cutting board that doesn't have grips on it like that, what happens is when the countertop starts getting wet, the cutting board starts slipping around, which is super annoying. So. There is a couple of ways to solve that. Usually what I'll do is I'll slip a wet dish rag underneath the cutting board, and then that will sort of hold things in place. But I love this cutting board because it doesn't move around. I don't have to do that. It's a spoiled shallot. Chinese shallots, man. That's looking better. So yeah, lots of people ask it, but yeah, about general maintenance stuff. I have done a couple of things to kind of take care of this cutting board. It did start warping at one point, which was really, really annoying. Generally, what most people do when your cutting board starts warping, you can probably just throw it out. That's probably the easiest thing to do, especially if you have like a really cheap cutting board that's only like 20, 30 bucks. you could just toss it. But what happens when your cutting board starts warping is that because the knife requires a flat surface, if it's warped when it comes down, when your knife comes down like this and it starts warping, the knife is not going to cut all the way through things that are really, really thin. So that's specifically been a big problem for me when I'm working with green onions, because the green onions are so thin that if you have a warped cutting board, your knife is not going to be able to cut through them, and it's really, really annoying because you'll end up with like partially cut green onions if you're cutting on the warped portion, which is really, really annoying. So what I had done at one point, I think this was, I did this like at some point during COVID, like the COVID shutdown, is I went through and like re-sanded the whole cutting board. So I like refinished it, which was very, very time consuming, and I would not recommend people do that. But I did manage to save the cutting board from that. So if you have the time to do it, that's a good way of saving a warped cutting board. But it is very, very annoying though. And then once I got the warp out of the cutting board, then it was just about like refinishing it and just sort of like general maintenance. If you want, you can get like wood care oils. So there's oils to take care of wood like this. What I usually do is I'll just give it a wipe down with a little bit of olive oil, and that seems to do the trick. Whatever it is that you do use for your cutting board that you want it. The reason, especially with cutting boards, that you use olive oil is because whatever you use to season that cutting board and sort of like do general maintenance on it, it's got to be food safe, because you don't want to use, for example, like wood varnishes, stuff like that, because that can leach off into your food, and then you're going to find yourself eating wood varnish, which is not good. But yeah, olive oil on a little bit of a paper towel, and then just give it a little bit of wipe down tends to work. Yeah. Yeah, wet towel. That's what I love that trick. Very useful. Yeah. The only problem with this cutting board, the only tricky problem with having those grips on the bottom of the cutting board, is that because they're there, you can't. So what lots of chefs like to do is flip the cutting board over, and then you can use the other side of the cutting board for other things. So like what you might do is maybe flip the cutting board over and use that other side for veggies while you chop meats on one side, something like that. I find what I found is that while I would love to do that, it ends up being a little bit more tricky with those grips on the bottom, because you can't flip it over anymore. So. Sorry. Anyway, here's our limes. We're slicing these up. These wedges, we're going to set these aside. These are going to be for our garnish. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this second half for our sauce base. Ooh, that's a lot of Spanish. Oh, cool. You said it in English, too. Is oregano seasoning good for this? You could use oregano in certain contexts. That would definitely be a sub. Oregano is more commonly found in like Italian and stuff. But what I've used, I've heard a lot of chefs subbing things like oregano, using oregano and bay leaf for swapping out some of like the licorice notes that you get from things like star anise and like allspice. But that would definitely fall in the category of like you're subbing something out, because I don't think I've ever seen like I don't think I've ever seen oregano come up in like a really traditional recipe. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it. Just know that when you do use something like that, just be aware of what you're doing and how it's affecting the recipe that you're cooking. You're guilty of flipping your plastic cutting board, yeah. Yeah, when we do food prep for the pop-up, I flip that cutting board over. Probably not with meats and veggies, but I would definitely flip it over. For like, say, if I was chopping shallots on one side and then I had like shallot leaves kind of stuck all over the cutting board, I might flip that over and then use the other side for like, I don't know, garlic or ginger or something. All right, there's our eggs, which we're just giving a quick whisk to. One last thing. Olive oil wipe down, yeah, cool. Yeah, very, very useful. All right, so for our protein today I'm using some tofu, which is a very, very common sub to use in pad thai. At least, especially here in the States, you'll see it come up quite a bit. In the original recipe, and very commonly when I cook this on live stream, you'll probably see me do it with chicken thigh. I love using chicken thigh because it has a lot of fat content to it and it sears really nicely. It's generally, when I'm wok cooking, probably the form of chicken that you're going to see me using the most. Today I'm using tofu because I have tofu and I don't have chicken, so here we are. Not the end of the world, but what we are going to do is kind of adjust the way that we cook our proteins today, because tofu, it sears a little bit differently from chicken. Mainly, as you might notice, there's a whole bunch of water on the cutting board. That's because tofu is bound together with water. This water poses a couple of problems, but the biggest and most pressing problem is that if that water, if it goes into your wok fry while you're trying to cook this tofu, you're going to end up steaming the tofu because the wok is going to be exerting all of its energy, burning off all of that water instead of doing what you want it to do, which is searing your tofu. So what we want to do before it gets into the wok fry, we want to shake this as thoroughly as possible. We want to get as much of this water out, and that's going to make sure that we can get as good of a sear as possible on it. If you're like super committed, you could even drop this into like a salad spinner or something. Firm tofu, it is very resilient, so it's not like that the soft tofu that you might see me using in things like a mapo tofu or something. Whereas this firm tofu, it's going to hold together, so we can shake the dickens out of it and it will still be okay. Yeah, cool. Let me know how that goes. Let me know what you end up using oregano for. I wouldn't say don't use it. I would just say just be aware when you use subs like that. So when you like swap out like rice vinegar for white vinegar, or if you swap out Shaoxing wine for dry cooking sherry or things like that. Anytime that you're subbing something, I don't have any problems with subbing. What I usually think about when I'm subbing something, because I sub stuff all the time, we've actually subbed 2 things in this recipe alone already. It's just like when you do it, think about, be aware of like how it's affecting the thing that you're cooking, and then the next time that you cook it, you can adjust. All right, so next up, these are my noodles, which are specifically pad thai noodles. I don't actually know why they call them pad thai noodles. I guess technically they are the noodles that go in pad thai, but they also go in lots of other things, so I don't know why they would call it that. All of these noodles that look like this are all made of the same stuff. It's really just about like how they're cut. So if you've ever watched any of our like beef chow fun recipes, for example, that is using the same noodle except they're cut wide. If you've watched like the pad see or pad kimao recipes, we're using the same thing. It's just chow fun noodle. This is essentially the same thing. This is still chow fun noodle, except it's cut really thinly. So we have these nice narrow strips of noodle. Just like we do when we're working with chow fun, though, we want to make sure that before we start cooking this stuff, before it heads into the wok, we want to start pulling these noodles apart, especially if you have stale chow fun, which is, this stuff is, I don't think that this is necessarily super stale, but it's right on the cusp of it. It's definitely like, I would like this to be a little bit more tender and not quite as brick-like, I guess. If you can't find the fresh stuff, which is what we're using today, you can also just use the freeze-dried stuff, which will always be pantry stable. I always keep that stuff, maybe a pack or 2 in the pantry. Same way I also keep like spaghetti and like rotini in the pantry. I also keep some rice noodles in the pantry for when I'm feeling lazy, or if I don't remember to go get these noodles, we can use that stuff. It's very useful for subs. But if you can find the fresh stuff, I always recommend doing it because it's night and day different. It's very tasty. It's also super tender and just kind of makes the whole dish. The tricky part about using fresh chow fun, like what we're using right now, is that it is extremely perishable, which means that like I would say within 24 hours it's probably going to start going stale, which is real pain in the ass. So what I always say is that if you're going to cook with the fresh stuff, you probably want to buy it the day of. So usually I bought this at the market earlier this afternoon, and because I got there late, I think it was like closer to like 4 p.m. or so, I was picking the bottom of the barrel, and then we ended up getting this, which is like a little bit stale. It's still fresh enough where it's still pulling apart, but when the noodles, when they start getting really stale, they don't pull apart at all. And basically what happens when we unravel it, like what we're doing right now, is they just end up sort of like breaking in half. which is what we're trying to avoid doing in general. That's the reason why I'm not just like diving in and pulling all of this stuff apart. That's because I'm trying to make sure that we hold as much of these long noodle strains together as we possibly can. We really want to make sure that we don't break these noodles as much as we possibly can. Eventually some of them are going to break. It's not the end of the world, but we want to try and preserve those long noodle strands as much as we possibly can. Have I had a fire in my wok? Yeah, I have fires in the wok happen all the time. How's it going, Courtney? Yeah, the fires in the wok happen all the time. Sometimes they're intentional, sometimes they're not. The fire in the wok, by the way, for those if you're not familiar, that's what we call wok hay, which is loosely translates to like breath of the wok. It's the thing that you associate with like any time that you watch somebody wok cooking. When the wok catches on fire, and then what's happening? First thing that happens is it's really, really flashy. That's why you see it on camera so often. It's because it looks really cool. But the other, also maybe more important thing that happens is that it's imparting a lot of like interesting smoky qualities to the wok, and it's the quality that you will associate with wok cooking in general. Is that really smoky quality? Sometimes when the wok catches on fire, it's because I'm intentionally trying to catch it on fire. But sometimes it catches on fire on the wrong side. So what we'll generally do is trying to like toss the wok, and what we're trying to do is light part of the wok on fire, but not the whole thing. We just want the end that's farthest away from us to light on fire. We don't want the part that's close to us to light on fire, because that's going to light your face on fire, which is not what we're after. So, but there have definitely been scenarios where that has happened, and it's not fun. Then there's a fire in your face. All right, this is relatively pulled apart. So this took maybe an extra 5 minutes or so, but I actually think this might be the most important step of what we're doing today. You really, when you're using the fresh stuff like this, don't want this to go straight into your wok as like a whole block. If you're lucky and if you have really fresh stuff, it might come apart, but there's probably a good 40-50% chance that it won't come apart, and then you're gonna have a hell of a time breaking that apart in your wok, and you'll probably end up with like a whole bunch of like really small broken fragmented bits of chow fun, which is not that good. So there's our noodles. We're gonna set that aside and didn't cut any meat today. All right, last up, we're going to start setting up our sauce base here. So what I much prefer, and I have not been able to find for a while, is some tamarind paste. I should have a fire extinguisher. I think I have a fire extinguisher. It is not in the kitchen right now, though. I do have a fire extinguisher. It's not in the kitchen right now, which is not great. It's in the garage. You're probably right. I should have a fire extinguisher. But anyway, I digress. So today what I'd like to be using is tamarind paste. What we're using today instead is pad thai sauce, which is this weird stuff that Lee Kum Kee makes. It's generally the stuff that you find in Chinese markets, because Lee Kum Kee is a Chinese brand, so they're getting it from the distributor, the same distributor that brings them things like hoisin sauce and oyster sauce, stuff like that, is where they get this pad thai sauce. What I'd like to be using is tamarind paste. The main difference is that a pad thai sauce like this, it contains other things, so it's mainly made of tamarind paste, which is going to be good. But it also includes a whole bunch of other stuff, like I think it's like shallot. It has some cumin in it. I think there's like some tomato paste in here. Let's see, sugar. It has a whole bunch of sugar added. There's a bunch of tamarind, but then there's also shallots. There's plum in it. There's paste, salt. There's vinegar. There's some chili in it. A whole bunch of stuff that I actually would like it to not be there. But because I can't find tamarind paste, here we are. All of the reason, by the way, why I don't like those things to be there is because those are all things that I'm actually going to add on my own. And I'd like to be able to adjust how that comes out a little bit better. So kind of the same reason why lots of people don't like using curry powder. They much prefer to make their own curry powders, because I just like to have a little bit more control over what that actually tastes like. Your friend's favorite dish is pad see ew. Yeah. It's the same noodles as pad thai. Yeah, same noodle. They're all really the same noodles. It's just that they're cut a little bit differently. So they're all. I'm not sure what it's actually called in Thai cuisine, but in Chinese food we refer to that as chow fun. So if you're at a Chinese market, They're all referred to the same thing. It's called chow fun. But you'll see it will be packaged differently. Generally, when you see the word chow fun, it's referring to wide rice noodles that are cut really, really thick, probably like an inch thick, not thick, but an inch wide. And that's the noodle you get with things like pad see ew, pad keema. Then you'll see it cut really, really thin. That's the noodle for pad thai. Sometimes you'll see it uncut entirely. That's the stuff that they use in like spring rolls and stuff. All of those, same noodle. What am I doing right now? Cool. So that's our tamarind paste. We're going to add a bunch of other stuff to it right now. This is my half of my lime. So this is that lime juice going in. And then it says 6 tablespoons of fish sauce, but that seems like too much fish sauce. I'm going to do 4 tablespoons of fish sauce because 6 is a lot. Maybe it might actually need 6 tablespoons. Cool, so that's our lime juice, there's our fish sauce, and one more thing. I think that's it. Yeah, cool. Cool, so that's our sauce for now. Then what we're gonna do here is we're gonna take these aromatics that we finished chopping up a little bit earlier. There's our garlic, ginger, then the whites of our green onions and our Thai chilies. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna bloom these aromatics out in some oil in the wok. And then we're going to add that back to our sauce base here. So we're going to give these 4 elements a quick wok fry in a little bit of peanut oil. And that's going to bloom out their aromatic qualities. Then we're going to infuse it into our sauce base. And that's going to give our sauce this nice aromatic quality that's infused with all of these wonderful veggies that we just finished chopping. Yeah. Also need to add the shallots. I forget the shallots a lot. Yeah. Cool. Let's head to the stove. Alrighty. So over on the stove, this is going to get heated up real hot. We're going to let that go for maybe another 30-40 seconds. And then once we have a very, very hot wok, we can get ahead and start cooking. Generally, when you see me cooking on a wok, especially on a home range, that home range is going to be cranked all the way up to literally as hot as it possibly can get. Because that home range, if you're trying to replicate the heat from a wok cook, it generally needs to be very, very hot. It's probably not hotter than what your home range can get to. So I don't think I ever go below high. If I'm stir frying, probably not dipping below high heat. Occasionally, I'll cook things that are not stir fried. Like the slow cooks, stuff like that, then you might turn the heat down on that stuff. But for something like this, very, very high heat. All right, so first up, these are aromatics going in. That's my garlic, as well as the ginger. Then the garlic. And the whites of our green onions. Then I'm going to give this maybe 10 seconds head start. It's going to bloom out all of that aromatic quality from it. Then next is going to be our shallots going in. And then what I like to do is just give this a little bit of a toss. We don't need that to cook all the way down. We still want those shallots to be relatively raw and crispy. But I like to give it a little bit of time to sort of like cut off some of that real raw harshness of the shallots. It's going to be nice. So give those a couple of tosses. We're going to let that go for maybe another like 30 seconds or so. Yeah. All right, last up for our aromatics, we're going to add our Thai chilies. I'm going to let this wok get a little bit hotter. I just started noticing that our wok is cooking a little bit low on heat right now. So I'm going to let that wok come back up a little bit. Give that maybe 20 seconds or so. You can smell the aromatics. Yeah, me too. So what we're doing is I'm letting this wok reheat a little bit because it's got a little bit of heat retention going on right now. So I'm moving things to one side. And then when we push stuff to one side, you'll notice all of this oil is starting to pool up here. That's all the cooking oil. And then when we start hearing that sizzling, we can start adding these chilies in. And I'll say this, anytime that we're cooking with Thai chilies, it's generally true anytime that you use chilies and leave the seeds in like that. You want to make sure that your windows are wide open. If those windows are closed, especially if you don't have an overhead fan like this one, it's going to start releasing a lot of capsaicin into the air. And then essentially what you're breathing in there is basically pepper spray, which is very, very caustic. So you want to make sure get those windows open as much as you possibly can. Otherwise, you're going to have yourself a coughing fit because you're breathing in pepper spray. All right. So there's our aromatics. I'm going to pull these out. Then we're going to reheat our wok and we're going to do our tofu next. So, and this, I mentioned this earlier, but also I'll mention it again, is the reason why I always considered a lot of Thai food, especially the noodle dishes like this one, a really great example of how to batch cook. Because what we're cooking, it contains so many ingredients. So we're using, that was garlic, ginger, green onions, that was some shallots, that was some Thai chilies, there's some tofu, some carrots that need to get in going, then we have our noodles. All of these things, because there's so many ingredients, they all have to be cooked on high heat. So if we were cooking on a very high restaurant burner heat, or if we were cooking on a wok burner, those things are kicking out heat at extremely high BTUs, which means that we can fill up that wok with all of these things, and you're going to continue to be cooking on extremely high heat. But in our case today, because we're cooking on our home burners like this, what's going to happen if we add those things to our wok all at the same time is it's going to end up cooking on a lot of like mediocre heat. So we're going to be cooking on like medium to medium low heat, which is not what we're after. So what we're doing is basically removing things and then adding things one piece at a time, which allows us to basically cook each ingredient on high heat. So what we're doing right now, this is our tofu. We're going to cook this while the wok is empty, and that's going to allow us to cook on extremely high heat, basically searing the tofu, like so. And if you're wise, probably use tongs for this part, but yeah, here we are. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding the tofu one piece at a time, because what I like to do is I like to make sure that the largest surface area of the tofu is facing downward. And what that's basically making sure is that when we're frying our tofu like we are right now, is that as much surface area as possible is going to make contact with that wok, which is going to help us create a really, really nice and crispy piece of tofu. If it's sitting on top of itself like this, for example, this is not going to cook, or that's not going to sear. It will cook, but it will basically end up steaming, which is not what we're after because we're trying to develop crispy tofu here. So I'm adding this one piece at a time. It takes another extra, like maybe 2 minutes. But that little bit of extra time, it's going to make a huge difference to the texture of the tofu. All right. Might be too much tofu, but here we are. If we were using chicken like in the original recipe, we would be doing the exact same thing, except we would be searing it in a little bit more oil because it would have a little bit less oil, because it would have all of that fat going on. So what I'm doing is, because we have all of this oil, but we have a rounded bottom to our wok here. So this wok, it rounds out at the bottom, which is very useful for shallow frying and basically stir frying like all of those veggies that we just did. Because what's happening is those veggies, they all meet at the center of the wok where all of the oil goes. and then we can fry a little bit more aggressively where the oil is meeting at the rounded bottom. When we sear stuff like this, for example, it causes a little bit of a problem with things like tofu because the oil, it all ends up right here, but the tofu is sitting out here. That stuff is not getting any contact with that oil, and when it doesn't make contact with the oil, what ends up happening is it's going to start burning, because the oil is very, very important to getting crispy tofu. Without that oil, it's just going to start burning. So if we don't do anything about it, this part of the tofu right here that's submerged in that oil, we're going to get nice tofu. That's essentially just going to deep fry because it's coated, it's basically submerged in oil. But this stuff that's out here, that's not going to get very much of a fry going. So what I like to do in order to compensate for that, just give that wok a little bit of a rotation, like so. Maybe every 30 seconds or so, rotate it, and that's going to kind of distribute that oil and make sure that the stuff on the exterior is going to get nice and oily. Yeah, I did plenty of tofu. Yeah, it will be excellent. Thank you. Cool. So what I like to do, and this is also the key for pretty much anything that you will ever sear, is that we want to stop fussing with the things that we're cooking. So other than the rotation of that oil, we don't want to be doing any shuffling, no more tossing. There's nothing else that we need to do. In order to make it sear, you have to stop touching it. That's like the big key. And this is not just true for tofu, but literally anything that you will ever sear, is you got to stop moving it around. Same thing's going to go for steaks. Same is true for like if you ever like done crispy fried rice, pork chops, hamburger patties. All of these things, they all sear in the same way. It follows the same simple principle of the Maillard reaction, which I will not try and get into because I am not a food scientist. All right. So I like to give that for about 2 minutes. For our tofu, it might take a little bit longer, maybe closer to 3 or 4 minutes. Tofu, it takes a little bit longer than some of the other proteins that we like to sear, things like rice or like pork chops or steak or beef, chicken. Some of those things, they can sear a little bit quicker because they don't contain quite as much water. With our tofu here, because we didn't necessarily squeeze all of that water out, the first thing that our wok is doing, it's not actually searing. The first thing that it's doing is burning off that water. So once that water burns off, then it starts searing, which is what we're seeing right here. All of this like nice crispy browning that's happening to some of these pieces. That's nice and browning, but we want to give it a little bit of extra time for that to happen across the board. This, by the way, if you have one, might work better on something flat bottom. You could probably do this a little bit better on like maybe a cast iron skillet or a stainless steel skillet, anything that's flat, because that oil is not moving around in the center of the wok or in the center of the skillet like this wok is doing. But I like to do it in the wok because I don't like cleaning multiple pans if I don't have to. Cool, so I'm gonna let that go. That's gonna go for maybe another 20, 30 seconds or so. Alright, let's take a look. There we go, that's nice and crispy. Might get lazy. If you're really committed, you could go in and flip each of them over. I'm super lazy, and I don't feel like doing that right now. If you want a really, really crispy piece of tofu, you could go in and do that, though, one piece at a time. What I like to do, just give it a wok toss, and then make sure that, mainly what we're making sure is that it doesn't stack on top of itself like that. We don't want that to happen. All right. Create TV is a national public access broadcast over there. That would be cool. Oh, cool. Yeah, I might look into that. Create TV. I'll check it out. Thank you. That's a cool tip. Yeah. New platforms. Social medias. All right. This is generally true for anything that you sear. This is especially things like pancakes and stuff. But the second side, it's probably not going to sear quite as well as the first side. So I just like to generally just give it a little bit of time, maybe give it a minute or two, and kind of give it an opportunity to cook a little bit. But for the most part, the crispiness is going to come from that first sear. The second sear, it's not going to be quite as good. But that's okay, though. Won't lose sleep over it. So there's our tofu. I'm going to go ahead and pull this out of our wok. Then I'm going to let that wok reheat one more time, and we can start cooking our veggies next. So as we start pulling stuff out of the wok, like we just did a couple of times, we now pulled 2 things out of the wok. We want to keep track of a couple of, the number one thing that we want to keep track of, this is especially true with anything that you're batch cooking, excuse me, is that we want to keep track of how much oil have we added to that wok now. So you want to remember when we cooked those aromatics, there was maybe 3 or 4 tablespoons of oil that went in there. And there was also maybe another 3 or 4 tablespoons of oil that went into our tofu. So as we cook, some of that oil, it stays behind, so that's okay. We're reusing some of that oil. But as we batch cook, we want to keep track of this because all of that oil is going to go back into the wok. All of these ingredients are going to go back in, which means that oil is going to go back in, which means that if you're not keeping track of that stuff, what will happen is when you add things to combine, it's going to become very, very oily because you're adding all of that oil back to the wok at the same time. So generally, I do a pretty good job of maybe when we get to our final stir fry like we're doing right now, we're going to add that's a lot less oil. That maybe is maybe like 2 tablespoons or so. And we're going to do our very, very best to cook on less oil. Because all we have to do is cook our carrots now. So that's a mistake that I made, I think, first couple of times that I made japchae. Because japchae requires so many batch cooks because it has so many ingredients, and if you're not careful and you're not paying attention to your batch cook, what will happen is that shit's just you're gonna end up adding like 1.5 cups of oil because you're not paying attention. So there's our carrots. We're gonna let that go. Maybe another like 30-45 seconds or so. We don't need to cook the carrots super long. We don't want like really, really tender carrots. We're not trying to create like home fried carrots and potatoes. Really just trying to cook off a little bit of this rawness before we add everything combined. But that julienne cut, it's going to do most of the work for us. Since those carrots are cut so thin, they should cook up pretty quickly. How long do I think the frying process is start to finish? It depends on like what you're cooking. For something like this, it's probably a little bit longer because we're batch cooking so much. And like especially with tofu, that sear probably took at least four minutes or so. With a lot of like the Chinese stir fry things like mapo tofu and like even like the kung pao chickens and stuff like that, those stir fry processes, they could go really, really quick, like under 5 minutes total for everything. Because we're cooking on such high heat, nothing really stays in the wok for super long. But in our case today, this is actually a little bit of a longer stir fry process. But yeah, generally, because that fire is so hot, the stir fry process, it can take can go really, really quickly. Good question. So there's our aromatics going back into the wok here. Where's my tofu? There it is. Then here's my tofu going in. And then finally is going to be, so the last two things that we have, well, three things that we haven't yet added. Here's our noodles, which I like to add maybe a handful at a time. We don't want to go and just drop all of it in because it still has the potential to start clumping up. So what I like to do is add a handful of noodles and then give it a handful of maybe a tablespoon or two of sauce, and then give that wok a turn. And then repeat. And essentially what that's doing is just making sure that things don't start clumping up on you. Rice noodles tend to do. Most importantly, especially at this point, is that you want to remember that the noodles that we're using, this chow fun, is extremely delicate, just like it was before. So we want once those noodles hit that wok, we're going to stop doing all of that really aggressive tossing. So no tossing things in the air like we were just doing earlier. We can't do that anymore because those noodles will start falling apart if you're not careful. So again, just like we were doing earlier, we're doing our very, very best to preserve those long strands of noodle as best as we possibly can. So now that the noodles are in the wok, I'm just very gently getting underneath and giving things a turn. That's it for our sauce. Actually, it for our noodles too. So once everything is in the wok, you'll notice you could actually hear it. Is that all of the sizzling is going to drop off from your wok. That's generally a sign you could listen. It's still sizzling a little bit, but it's really what that means is that your wok, it doesn't have extremely high heat like it used to, because there's all of this stuff in it. So if you were still cooking stuff, that would be a real big problem if we were still cooking tofu or carrots or something like that. In our case right now, that's going to be totally fine because there's nothing left to cook. But if you do notice that happening and you're still cooking things, you want to stop what you're doing because you're cooking on medium heat, which is never good. So the last thing that I'm doing, those were my eggs going in. I like to just add those around the side because it kind of helps the eggs set a little bit. And then we're just giving everything a little bit of a turn. And that's going to kind of let the rest of those eggs set for us. So I'm going to give it maybe another like 30 seconds or so and really let those eggs set. Some of that will also set on residual heat too, so that's going to be okay. Yeah, this YouTube camera is exposure dying. That's good. So I'm removing from heat. The last thing that we want to do anytime that we're cooking in a wok, same thing that I say pretty much anytime that we cook in this wok, is give it a rinse and give it a wipe down. While that wok is hot, you have this nice non-stick surface going on. Once things cool down, stuff is going to start sticking to it, which is never fun. You're not going to risk warping it. You don't need to worry about that too much. Just give it a quick rinse and then wipe off that moisture, and that should really do the trick. Maybe every like 5 or 6 cooks, you'll see me giving it a coat of oil too. That's going to just kind of keep things from rusting on you. I don't do it after every cook anymore, but every once in a while it keeps things from rusting on you. Nope. there's not. Alrighty. Looks good, yeah, thank you. Last up, I'm finishing. These are the greens of my green onions. You could also finish that with some cilantro if you have some. Don't use parsley because that's not the same thing. It looks like the same thing. And then finally, this is going to be a little bit of a squeeze of some fresh lime juice. How to do that? Cool. Alright, that's it everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. If this is your first time tuning in, we're here every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 PST with new recipes out over on my YouTube channel, which is where this stream is going. Every Friday, so many Fridays ago, I think this was like back in like July or August of 2020 or something like that. We came out with a recipe for this pad thai, which used a couple of different ingredients. I believe in that recipe I used some cilantro. I may have accidentally used parsley because I wasn't paying attention that day. I think we also used a jalapeno in that recipe instead of the Thai chilies that we use today. But all of those things, they always live over on the YouTube channel, so new stuff coming out every Friday. Last Friday we came out with a recipe, it was actually not a recipe, but a video for Pantry Basics, which is basically detailing all of the stuff that's in this pantry behind me. Because lots of people ask me like, what are all of these things and how do I cook with them, and like how do I decide if you're starting to build out your own pantry, like what are the things to buy and like what are the most important ones, what are the less important ones, because there's definitely a priority to some of those things. So that seems to have been a pretty helpful video for lots of folks. So if you're interested in stuff like that, that lives over there. This coming Friday is going to be a recipe for, we're doing xiaolongbao, which is a Chinese soup dumpling. I have honestly said, and I will stand by this, one of the hardest things that I've ever made is a xiaolongbao. But we did it, we figured it out. It was not the best xiaolongbao, but also like xiaolongbaos are some of those, one of the things that like some families will guard that secret for hundreds of years because they're that hard to make. So we did that. That's coming out this Friday. We're going to take a look at how to make that stuff. I will not be cooking that on live stream because it is really, really hard to make, and I probably will fuck it up if I did it live. So. But lots of stuff like that coming up over on the YouTube channel every Friday. We're working our way up to 5,500 subscribers by the end of October, so if you want to help us hit our subscriber goal, please hop over and subscribe. Lots of fun stuff coming up. What else? If you're here in the Bay Area, we're going to be doing a pop-up this coming Halloween on the 31st. That's at that's at Degrees Plato. We're going to be filling in for a restaurant called Popaka here in Oakland, so if you're interested in stuff like that, head over to the website. That's at wucancook.com/eats. We have this fun new pop-up where we've been doing lots of dishes like this. Basically all the stuff that we cook on live stream, we've been serving it to people in real life, which is cool and fun. And I've actually met lots of these people on Reddit from just serving food. So, cool. Thanks everyone for tuning in. My name is Wesley. We'll be back this coming Thursday. I don't remember what we're cooking, but we're going to be cooking something this coming Thursday, and I'll see you soon. Bye.
If you think that you don't know, never mind that you still don't love yourself. No, you can find it from somebody else. No, everybody's got to grow up sometime. Funny how we shoot the mood. Still, when we fighting, baby. Alright, never mind. Then I found what I'm looking for, baby. Yes, I found it now. Alright, I'm finally in love with love, and it's freaking me down. Do you want to be, baby? Yes, do you want to be, baby? Alright. Oh, wait now, babe. I said everybody wants to be different. They still got dreams, but they don't love me like they used to love it. And I'm reminded of how bad I used to want it. And yes, I still got dreams, but more like a took of my 20s, and it's breaking me down. Oh, no. Do you want to be, baby? Yes, do you want to be? Stone on you all the time. I strawberry wine. Ooh, yeah. You're as warm as a glass of beer. Darling, I'll stay. Store on your love all the time. You're as smooth as Tennessee whiskey. You're as sweet as strawberry wine. You're bad. Glass of brandy, darling, I'll stay. Stone on your love all the time.